Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming to our mobile development workshop. Today, our speaker is Arjun Kunjilwar. He is the current tech director for Freetail Hackers. Feel free to Slack in with any questions about the logistics of the event or about anything he speaks about today. Unfortunately, we will not have his beautiful face on screen today since his internet is a little slow, and we want him to be able to share the code, which is just barely more important than seeing him. So I will let him take it away.
Hello, everyone. Hope Summer Hacks is going great for everyone so far. So I'm gonna go ahead and start sharing my screen. The way today's workshop is just gonna go is I'll briefly talk about React Native. We'll go through a PowerPoint with just some of the basics, and then we'll go through a small demo on building like a Pokemon dictionary app. And if you are not able to code along, that's completely fine. I'm gonna push all the code to GitHub later. So if you want all the full code, if you just want a reference, you can just pull it from there. And with that, I'll start sharing. Can y'all see my screen? Okay. So first things first, let's just introduce what React is basically. React.js is a JavaScript library developed by Facebook for designing responsive UI applications. And React Native is a framework that allows you to build cross-platform apps by combining React.js with native platform capabilities. So with React Native, you can build iOS, Android, and web apps. And basically there's like a bunch of generalizability that the React.js library gives you. And then the framework helps take care of all the differences between the native platforms themselves. With that being said, though, there are two different flavors that React Native really comes in. There's Vanilla React, Vanilla React Native, which Facebook kind of gives us. And there's Expo. Expo is a framework that acts like a toolchain around React Native. It abstracts some things and it's much friendlier for beginners. The code is it's not too much is like shown to you, and it's much cleaner to maintain that way. There are some limitations to that. I'll try to talk about those at the end. If you check out our Ultimate Hackathon guide though, we talk more about it there. But for this tutorial, we're just gonna focus on using Expo. Just another note between Expo and Vanilla React Native is that the code between the two usually will not be any different. It's just kind of the packages and libraries you use that might be different. Okay, so the central kind of building block of React is called components. And these are basically just the elements that make up your UI. If you're familiar with HTML, components are basically like elements. As you see in this example here with the view, image, and text, you can think of everything in angular brackets as a component. So a view is a component, image, text, those are built-in components that are given to us. And so if you're familiar with HTML, then this will be really similar to you. Along with components, you can give things called attributes, and these are like key value pairs. So some examples of attributes are like style. For an image, you have a source like the image name. Other things might be like width or height. And these are just like already defined things, and you just specify a value. And yeah, so you can, as you see here, some components are just simple things like an image, but some things are like container components and they can have children within them. So a view over here is like a parent component, and nested within it are an image and text components. And the way, the beauty of React basically is that you can make your own components by nesting existing components just like this. That way that reduces a lot of redundancy in your code. And yeah. So there are two types of components basically. There's functional components and class components. Functional components are the simpler type. You use these when you don't need to track any state. And I'll come back to what state is basically. But these are more like components that won't ever update. You just, whenever you create it, what you get back is what's gonna stay the way as it is for its lifetime, basically. Class components, on the other hand, store state, and these update as your state changes. And so an example where you might want a class component is like a timer. If you're showing the amount of time left, you'd want that text to keep updating every second. So a class component makes more sense there. There are some advanced React concepts that do blur these lines kind of. You can actually store some state with functional components, but that's for you to explore further. We won't talk about that here. If you do need to update and keep state, which I'll bring up, I promise, we recommend using class components. So yeah, so now to bring up what state and props are. So you can think of state as like instance variables if you're familiar with other programming languages. And these are basically properties specific to a particular instance of a component. So if, for example, if a person was a component, if you had a person component, you might have some properties like their name, age, other things that are like defining to that, like unique descriptors would form the state. Another important concept in React, but that's not really related to state, is called props. This is just something you'll see a lot. These are parameters that you pass when initializing or updating a component, and props is just short for properties. Again, these two are not really related. These are just two very common things you'll see in React. So I just brought them up here. Another big thing that we need to look at is the life cycle. All components have a life cycle. If they're a class component, you'll explicitly probably use these life cycle methods to override them. And there's more than just these four, but these are like the most important ones, I'd say. The constructor is where you initialize a component. So if I have like a text view, or actually, no, sorry. If I have, actually we'll come to an example, but this is where you initialize your state of your component. And the component did mount method that runs after the constructor. And this runs after your component is attached to a DOM. DOM is, in case you don't know, it's a document object model. And you can basically think of that as like a tree that defines how your views are laid out in the UI or on the screen, basically. So after your component is attached to this tree, basically, component did mount will run, and it only runs once. The render method is probably the biggest method that we're going to use the most frequently. This is called every time the state changes. This is where you define the UI layout, and this method gets called every time you need to update the UI, basically. Component will unmount is called right before the component is being removed from the screen, basically. It's just like kind of like being destroyed. Yes. So a simple example, not even with pseudocode really, but just what kind of things you would put in each method. If we had a component for like a timer, in the constructor, we might take in a parameter, of props, of time we want to set on the time. So let's say 15 seconds. So I would set that time there. In component did mount, I'm gonna set up like maybe a cron job or not a cron job, just a job that will set an interval to decrement the amount of time left every 1 second. So this might just run in the background, and after every 1 second, my state will update and the amount of time will decrease by 1. Every time my state changes, that's gonna trigger the render method to be called. And in my render method, I'm gonna return maybe a text label that shows the amount of time that's left. So every time my state changes, because of the timer being ticked down, I'm gonna recall render. And then finally, component will unmount. If, let's say the time finally runs out, if I wanna remove the timer, I would call component will unmount. Okay, so for the demo, we're gonna be making a Pokemon dictionary app. It's supposed to look like this. Unfortunately, this might take a bit longer than the time that the workshop is. So I'm going to exclude just a few things. In the final code that I upload to GitHub, I will include everything. But just for the demo's sake, we might leave some things out, okay? And I just want to preface this by saying that this entire app idea was borrowed from a Udemy course that I took a few years ago. It was created by DevSlopes, and it was originally code for iOS written in Swift, and I have adapted it for React Native for this example. So the main things we're going to focus on, as you see here, we have a grid with a cell for each Pokemon, and we are going to have like a specified data file with a bunch of Pokemon, and we're just going to make a grid out of them. That's going to be the first part. Second part is going to be when you click on a Pokemon, it's going to take you to a detailed screen where you can get more information about the Pokemon. And this information will be pulled from an API. And so basically what we're going to look at is adding some like basic built-in React Native components for like a grid, text box images. We're going to look at how to implement navigation so you can move between screens. And then the last thing we're going to look at is how to make API requests. The custom fonts, we might not get to that. I'll see if we have enough time at the end, but yeah. So before starting, I'm not going to do this part during the demo just because this actually takes a bit of time. But if you want to set up Expo, these are the main steps. First, you should install the Expo command line interface. NPM is Node Package Manager. You can use this to install it through your terminal. And then once that is set up to initialize an Expo project, you just run Expo init and then the name of your project basically. And then after that, it'll make a directory with that project name. You can move into that directory and run expo start, and that will, it'll start. So it'll actually start a browser. I'll actually run that here. In the meantime though, okay. Yeah. Okay, so when you run expo start, it'll open this page in your browser basically, and it'll give you a bunch of options here. You can run the app on an iOS simulator if you have support for that on your laptop. Only Mac laptops have that at the moment. You can run it on an Android emulator as well. The best thing though is probably to run it on your own phone. On both the iOS App Store and the Google Play Store, there's an app called EXO Client. If you download that and then you scan this QR code down here with your camera app, it'll open the project that you're working on inside that app. And that's probably the easiest way to set up. So I definitely recommend that. Find this. But for the demo, I'm just gonna go ahead and run it on an iOS simulator just so that you can see what I'm doing basically. Okay, so I'm gonna keep the code and this simulator side by side. Hopefully, what's supposed to happen is every time you make a code change, the app is supposed to restart so that you can basically see your changes immediately without having to manually restart the app. And that's one of the best things about using React Native. But this might take some time to load. As this loads, does anyone have any questions? Yes. Okay. So in the meantime, I'll just go ahead and walk through this code. Hopefully the simulator will start up by then. But whenever you create an EXO project, the main file you want to first look at is app.js. So the app component here, this is the entirety of the app component. Notice that this is a class component, okay? It's a class. We have our lifecycle methods, a constructor, component did mount, we have render here. We'll look at functional components a little later. There's an example of that as well, but this is just what a class component looks like if you have these specified lifecycle methods within it. So whatever is in your render method in app.js is what's going to show up on the screen when it starts to run. Okay, so yeah. Okay. Okay, so right now, the only thing that's being shown up on the screen is a Pokemon grid. That's what's in our render method. And as you can probably guess, Pokemon grid is another custom defined component. So for this tutorial, I went ahead and put all the components that we're going to define in this views subfolder. So if we go to Pokemon grid, again, this is another class component. And this is the structure that if you are making class components, this is what you'll want to follow. So let's just look right at the render method. Right now, what it's returning is a safe area view and a text element. And as you can see, this text is what is currently showing up on the screen right here. Safe area view is just like it's like a variant of a regular view. One thing, if we take this out and just convert it to a regular view. So every time you reference like a built-in component type, you're gonna wanna import it from React Native usually, otherwise it'll throw an error. So if you look here, it's overlapping with the status bar, and that's because it's just going to the top of the view basically. With safe area view, it takes into account the status bar on iPhones, and it'll start your content a little bit lower to account for that. And so right now, all we have is, just a safe area view and text. So throughout this tutorial, whenever you want to add style, you use the style attribute, and you define styles using something called a style sheet. You use style sheet.create, and these are like different classes. You're familiar with this is really similar, but these are some properties that basically are used for how you want to style your UI. I'm not really going to talk about the style just because that could like be its own kind of workshop on its own. And this is more like just focused on React. But these styles, so throughout the tutorial, I'm just going to add style classes to these components, and it's just going to like magically align itself. I encourage you to look back at the styles just to see what's really happening there. Yeah. But with that being said, let's go ahead and start changing the UI. The first thing we probably want to do is, if you noticed in the final or in the screenshot that I showed in the PowerPoint, we have a nice background. So we have a background in the assets folder. It's called bg.png, and it just looks like this. If we want that to be on our screen, there's a special component for that called image background. And it's basically a container. And so I'm just going to add these styles to it. Just add styles.image. Again, that's defined below. I'm not going to talk about it much, but you can look back at it later. And the important attribute, though, is called source. This is basically where the image is coming from. Now, in React Native, in order to add like a local image, you have to use something called require. So require and then the file name. So the file name is in assets bg.png. One thing I kind of want to point out before continuing is that these use of curly braces here. Normally, like these are attributes, key value pairs. If you normally in HTML, for example, all the values would be strings, like just flat out strings. But in React Native, you have the ability to combine variables in your values. And whenever you need to combine variables, you have to put them in curly braces like this. So since styles container, styles image, this require is like a function and you're getting a value from it. These are all basically dynamically set variables. You need to wrap them in curly braces. Yeah. So if I go ahead and save this now, hopefully it will, yeah. So now we see a background here. So the next thing we want to do is probably look at our Pokemon data itself. So there's a data folder and there's a file called pokemon.json. If you're not familiar with what JSON is, JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. And basically, it's just a structured way of storing our data so that we can use it easier. This right here is raw JSON. It's not really pretty to look at. In the PowerPoint, yeah. So this is kind of the structure of the JSON file itself. Anything within curly braces in a JSON file is called an object. So the file consists of basically one giant object. And then you have key value pairs. Key value pairs form your object. You can think of it like a dictionary or a map in other languages. So in this Pokemon JSON file, we have one key called Pokemon data, and it's basically an array. That's what these square brackets are. And it's an array of objects. There's more curly braces here, an array of objects, basically, an object for each Pokemon. Each Pokemon is assigned an ID, it's assigned an identifier, and as you see here, we have 718 different Pokemon in this data set. There are other properties as well, like species ID, height, weight, base experience. For this data set, though, the only ones that we're going to use are ID and identifier. So yeah. So the easiest way to import a JSON file, that's actually one thing to point out. Whenever you're reading data in JavaScript, JSON is like the easiest way to import. If you store data in other formats like a TXT file or a CSV, you're probably going to need a little more effort to actually read it in. But to read in a JSON object, it's as simple as just doing this. So full data will be my JSON object, basically. So now looking back here, if we were to do like full data equals this giant object, the way, if I wanted something like, if I wanted Ivysaur's ID, I would just do full data Pokemon ID. I would get the second element. JavaScript is 0-bit indexed, so this would be index 1 actually, not 2. That would get me the second object in this array, and I could get its ID, or similarly, I could get its name. You can use either the dot operator here, like dot name, or you can use subscripting like this. Either one is fine, and we'll probably stick with the dot one, but it's just preference again. So the React Native comes with a defined way to show like a grid, and it's called a flat list. Again, this is a built-in component. This is a component that cannot have any children in it, so it's gonna just look like this. Anytime if it can't have children, you'll have a start tag and you'll have a separate end tag. If it can't have children in it, it will just be a single tag and it'll have this / at the end. But with this flat list, we have several attributes that need to be defined. First is the data attribute. This will just be an array, basically, where I need to convert each element of the array into a cell that shows up on the screen. So my data source basically will be full data. And remember that full data, as you see in the PowerPoint, that's a full object. We only want this array part of it. So to get that, I'm gonna do full data dot Pokemon data. Like the next important attribute is RenderItem. I'm gonna go ahead and write this first and then explain what it is a little. Okay. So if you're not familiar with this syntax, this is called like an anonymous function in JavaScript. Regular functions have like a function name, they have a parameters list, and then they have a function body and like return value. Anonymous functions, they don't have a name, hence they're anonymous. But it's just a more compact way of writing it. So what it's taking in is a single parameter. It's an item, and basically this is just going to be each array element in my data here. Data is an array, and then the flat list internally is going to pass each element through my RenderItem function. Each one is going to be an item, and then this arrow signifies that this is basically what I'm going to return out of it. Yeah, so this is like a return statement. So for each item, for each item in the array, I want to create a view. It'll just be a simple view for now, and I've just styled it with grid cell, like with a style that I defined earlier, and it should just be like kind of just an empty cell for right now. We're still not done yet. There's 2 more attributes to add. We have key extractor. This is basically just a way to tell the flat list a unique defining characteristic of each element in the array. So in order for it to distinguish what's on the screen at the time, it should be something that is unique to each basically element. So one unique thing is the ID. For each Pokemon object here, the ID will be a different number. No 2 will have the same. So I can use that as my key, basically. The last attribute that we need is num columns. And this is just the number of columns that are going to show up on the screen. So I'm going to set it to 3 for now. And then actually there's one more, just some styles for the grid. And one other thing I forgot is probably to import the flat list here. It also comes from React Native. And then, so once we save, we get this basically empty screen. So one thing I want to point out right now, this is more of a technical detail, but this is something you might want to know later on, is that even though, so there's 718 cells on the screen because there's 718 Pokemon, but they're not all loaded in at memory at once, because if we had all 718, the app would be extremely unresponsive. It might even crash very quickly. So what really happens is every time I scroll, every time a cell leaves from the screen, its cell is being recycled to be reused for a cell that is now showing up on the screen. So as I scroll up, cells that are leaving the screen are now being used for cells that are entering from the bottom. And that means that only about like 15 cells need to be loaded in memory at once, which is much more efficient. And this is not just something that's for React Native. This is probably for all mobile development platforms, and it's a really important thing. There can be some bugs if you assume that everything is loaded in at memory at once. I think you won't have to worry about that for React Native, but just letting you know in case. Okay, so obviously we don't just want a white cell like this. We actually want a Pokemon in, like a Pokemon image in there. So we go to another custom component called Pokemon cell. Over here, this is a functional component. This is just a single function that I call. I'm going to call Pokemon cell, pass in some props. And this is basically just a render method. It's just returning some like markup syntax. So right now, it's just a small view. If you look back on this, if we look back on what it's supposed to look like, we want an image of a Pokemon and then some text below it of its name. So I'm just going to go ahead and add those two things right now. The styles will just be, and again, it's just defined at the bottom. So one thing, so before actually going to this, we should talk about kind of what props are going to be passed in for this component. And basically, in order to have enough information for this Pokemon cell, I'm going to need to know the ID as well as the Pokemon name. That way, the name is for the text view and the ID is for the image. So the way that the Pokemon images are stored, if you go to assets, Pokemon assets, there is a file for each Pokemon and it's named after its ID. So Bulbasaur had an ID of 1, so its file name is 1.png. Ivysaur was 2, so 2.png, and similarly for all of them there. So the way we would probably want to access the source, the image, oh, sorry, this doesn't go there. The image source would be, again, require, and then we would want require assets, and then this is in another folder called Pokemon assets. And then we would want something like this, like props. Get another object, so you can just fields from it just by dot. And then we would want dot .png. That's what we want to do, but you can't do this in React Native because whatever goes inside the require statement needs to be a full string. There can't be any variables. And this is kind of one limitation that I could not really find a workaround on. Many developers also did not really post very elegant solutions to this. So the way I got around this was just, let's see, we have a giant switch statement with 718 cases that just takes in a Pokemon ID, and then it'll just return the specific file name for it. So if it's case 1, it'll just return 1.png, 2, same thing. And so if you want, you might end up having to use this in your project, something like this. So I have a Python script here that allows you to generate JavaScript, like a giant switch statement, output it into a file, and it'll just, for example here, it'll just do it for 718 different cases. So I won't go too much into this, but it's there if you ever need it. So instead of using require here, we're gonna go ahead and use that, that function. So first thing, we're gonna have to import it. Import get image. So one other thing to note is that if you have something in one file that you want to use in another file, you need to put the word export before it. That way it can be imported by other classes. So that's for functions, variables, classes. You might have seen the word export being used practically a lot of places. That's because like over here, I need to export this Pokemon cell function because in my Pokemon grid class, I'm gonna end up using it there. So that's just something to keep in mind as well. Otherwise, I'm gonna call get image require here. And then I'm going to, so get image require actually expects an integer. The ID that's passed into us is a string. So I'm gonna convert that string to an integer using the parse int function. That's just a JavaScript function. So I'm gonna pass in props.id, and then the last thing we wanted was a text view. And so the style for this will be styles.name. And then the text that I want, so text is, it has an open and close tag. The text that I want goes in between here. Since this is another variable, it's basically a props that's passed in, I need the curly braces. So we're gonna call this props.name here. So right now, this will not compile actually, because we have not specified any props to pass in. So props.id and props.name do not exist yet. So let's go ahead and fix that. So here in back in our grid class, in our RenderItem function, instead of returning a blank view, what we're going to do instead is we'll still return a view, but we're going to put a Pokemon cell as a child. And the way you pass props is basically, they're just regular attributes. So since I needed a prop called ID, I'm going to do ID equals item.id. I needed a name attribute. If you look back here, the name is actually in a field called Identifier. So when I'm past my item here, I'm gonna need to get the identifier field, but I'm gonna go ahead and call that prop name so that when it gets to my Pokemon cell, I can use props.name. Yeah, so that's it. The other thing is we have to import Pokemon. Okay. So I think this file is at an upper directory. Image, okay. Also need to import image and text. Okay, so now we have this beautiful kind of grid with a bunch of Pokemon, and that's really cool so far, yeah. The next thing we want to focus on is making these clickable so that they can navigate to new screens. And this is really simple to do in React Native. There's a built-in component called a touchable. So there's actually different kinds of touchables. We're going to use one called touchable highlight. But as you can see from the dropdown here, there's a bunch of different types, I guess. All we're gonna do is change this view that's being returned inside of a touchable highlight. So the way a touchable highlight basically works is you wrap it around whatever you want to be clickable. And then so the touchable highlight is not actually a view that shows up on the screen, but you wrap it around what does show up on the screen. And whenever that's clicked on, the touchable highlight will take care of triggering something. And whatever is triggered, there's an attribute called onPress. And this is, again, a function that should be triggered whenever we click on something. So for now, I'm just going to make it simple. I'm just going to go ahead and console.log clicked. And again, this is another anonymous function. What this is just doing is this takes in no parameters, and this is like the function body, just print this out. Okay. So now if I click this, can't probably see it yet. Yeah, so here it's getting clicked. I clicked it 5 times, so it's just printing out clicked. That's great, but we obviously want it to do something better than that. So now we need to introduce the next thing, which is navigation. So React Native doesn't come with navigation built in. So there's an external library called React Navigation that's better for this. So the way, if you set up properly, these are some packages that are already defined. And if you install them properly, or sorry, if you just run the automatic install, it'll be included for you. So what we want is, we want something called a navigation container from a library called React Navigation /native. And then we also want something called we also want this function called create stack navigator again, from the React navigation library, but a separate part of it called stack. So the first thing we do to implement navigation is we create a stack, a navigation stack. And the easiest, the most intuitive way to think about it is whenever you visit a screen, you're pushing that screen onto a stack. And so if you visit several screens in succession, you're just pushing them onto a growing stack. And then as you exit each screen, you're just popping that screen from the stack. So to create that stack, you call this function, create stack navigator. Now, so now we're gonna go ahead and change our render method. We're not gonna return a Pokemon grid anymore. Instead, we're gonna return a navigation container. And that will basically handle a lot of the navigation for us. There's another component called stack.navigator. Screen options, these are defined for you below. But screen options basically define how, so with the navigation container, a nav bar is going to show up at the top, and screen options are like attributes for how the nav bar is going to look like. Okay. And then within the stack.navigator, we're going to have some other components called stack.screen. And these are basically the different kinds of screens that this navigation container can handle. So I'm gonna have a screen type called grid, and that's the grid we've currently made. And this component type is supposed to basically just be a component that it's going to render whenever we want this type of screen. So obviously we're going to use the Pokemon grid for that. And then this is just, yeah, there's no children with this attribute. It's just a single stack.screen. So that's the first type of screen, and that's what we have made so far. But we also want a detailed view for each Pokemon. So we're gonna define another screen type, and I'm gonna call this one detailed. And the component, we have not looked at this yet, but it's gonna be called Pokemon detailed. Yeah. Okay, and as you see, it automatically imported that view, or sorry, that component for me. Yeah, so this is basically these are the two types of screens that our app will support. And in order to navigate to one of them, you're gonna need to keep track of this name attribute. So remember that we've called this screen detailed. That's what we're gonna use to navigate from the grid to Pokemon detailed component. So in order to trigger navigations, though, we're going to need a navigator object. And whenever a screen is being created, like, so here, if we go to this component here, the navigation container is gonna pass navigation object whenever that screen is being initialized. So now we're gonna go to our constructor and we're gonna keep track of that navigation object so that we can use it later to kind of transition to a new screen. So in order to set state in React, what you do is state is basically just another object kind of dictionary like this. And so I'm gonna set a field called navigator, and whenever it's passed in, it's going to be called navigation. Yeah. So this is a key. This is the name of the field. I can call this whatever I want. But when it's passed, whenever the navigation container passes that navigator object to us, this is going to be the official name for it. Yeah. Okay, so now we have a method here called goToDetailed. And this over here, we're just gonna say this.state.navigator. That's how you access fields in your state. And we're gonna call a function called navigate. And we're going to tell it which screen to go to by the name. Again, it's called detailed. And the second parameter is gonna be null. This parameter is basically what data we wanna pass to it. We are gonna pass some data to it, but for right now, let's just leave it at null. One problem with this current setup though is that we need to bind this method to the instance. And what I mean by that is we do something like this. This.goToDetailed.bind this. Binding is basically necessary because this function here accesses the specific state of this component instance. And unless you bind the function like I did, whenever function gets run, it will not be able to access the state. You can kind of think of it as this is just an ordinary function that has no understanding of anything that's going on with React, basically. Like it doesn't know about the state. And that's why you need to bind it over here. So then, yeah. So then I'm gonna change my onPress over here. So instead of console.logging a clicked message, I'm gonna return, I'm gonna call this .go to detailed. And as you see here, this is all part of the bigger render item anonymous function. This is getting a little messy because there's like a nested anonymous function. But remember, our original parameter is an item, which is a cell from that Pokemon data file. And what we want is the ID. And that's going to basically be our index. So I'm just going to pass the item.id. Yeah. And then now if I compile and refresh, whenever I click on an item, yeah. So I'm not sure about what this is. Give me a minute to look for this, or like for what's up. I think I didn't save this. Cannot find variables. Okay, so yeah, I think it was just on this file not being saved yet. So now whenever I click on a cell, I'm taken to this new screen that's kind of bare right now, but yeah. So every time I click on a cell, it just goes to that new screen and I can click back and it pops this detailed screen from the stack that I was talking about earlier, and we go back to the grid that was already existing.
Hey,
So,
Arjun, I don't mean to cut in here. We only have 5 more minutes left. So really quick, if anyone wants to ask any questions, please do so quickly. And if not, Arjun, just go for a few more minutes and then we can wrap it up.
okay. Yeah, since we're running out of time, actually, I guess I'll just talk about what else was supposed to be in the tutorial. And then again, I'll post the rest of the code on GitHub. Sorry, this went kind of long. Basically what was next was in go to detailed, we were gonna make an API request to get more information about each Pokemon. We're gonna we're gonna use that to populate this screen, basically. And that was pretty much the last thing. Unfortunately, we couldn't get to that. But again, if you wanna look at that, it'll be on GitHub later. Other important links that just kind of to account for full code to the project, this GitHub here, it'll be in the Slack as well. Check out our Ultimate Hackathon guide with especially the mobile dev section. There's not just resources for React Native, but if you're interested in native iOS or native Android as well, there's help there as well. I definitely suggest looking at the React Native documentation and the Expo documentation. There's the Expo documentation especially. They have a huge list of features that they have on the side here that you can use, Apple authentication, barcode scanner. There's a lot they support here. Similarly, Facebook's React Native documentation, they have a list of all the built-in components that they support as well. So yeah, I guess, yeah, I'll leave it there. If anyone has any questions, I'd be glad to answer them. But again, I'll post the rest of it on GitHub and I'll try to comment it a little better just to make up for me not being able to talk about it.
We'll also have all of these links available under the YouTube video when it goes up, in case any of you want to go back and watch again. All right. Well, I don't think there are any questions. So anyway, thank you very much, Arjun, for speaking. Thank you, all of you, for coming. You are, of course, welcome to text Arjun or any of us with questions. Arjun is available in the Slack as a mentor and an organizer. And I hope to see you guys at our web development workshop tomorrow. We're going to be doing some cool HTML animation stuff with one of our mentors. So definitely don't miss out on that. Thank you all for coming and have a good one.